I grew up in Cedar Grove, a quiet suburban town in New Hampshire, in a modest two-story house with cream-colored siding, a small garden in the front, and a wooden swing set in the backyard. On the outside, everything looked perfectly normal, the kind of neighborhood families photographed for holiday cards. But inside, my world spun around my older brother, Jonathan. From the moment he arrived 2 years before me, he became the golden center of my parents' attention. It wasn't subtle, it was everywhere. In the living room, entire shelves were filled with his Little League trophies, team photographs, and meticulously framed report cards. Whenever he reached a milestone, my parents celebrated as if the universe itself had aligned. When he outgrew one bedroom theme, they redecorated with gusto. First airplanes, then soccer banners, and finally a teens sanctuary with dark blue walls, a study desk, and a bed that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Meanwhile, my own room stayed the same soft yellow it had been since kindergarten, complete with the same worn twin bed and floral curtains. Even gifts carried their own story. One Christmas, Jonathan unwrapped a signed hockey puck from the Boston Bruins, and my father's eyes sparkled with delight. When it was my turn, I received a thick encyclopedia, still stiff from the store. "I know you love learning," my mother said, but even at 10, I understood the difference. A puck could be displayed proudly. A dictionary remained tucked away, barely noticed. School achievements fared no better. When I won the regional science fair with a project on renewable energy, my parents gave distracted congratulations and then hurried off to Jonathan's soccer match. That was my first lesson. My value was measured by how neatly I fit into their vision of the perfect son and his accommodating, quiet sister. By the age of 13, I stopped expecting applause. Instead, I started cultivating a quiet determination. If love at home was conditional, my future wouldn't be. That future began in the warmth of my grandmother's kitchen. My grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, had a sharp eye and a sharp mind. She had been one of the first female accountants in Boston and retired with her intellect intact. While my parents hovered around Jonathan's practices, I often walked the half-mile to her brick house, drawn by the scent of cinnamon buns always lingering in the air. One afternoon, when I was 15, she set aside her knitting and asked me, "Do you know about compound interest?" I shook my head, expecting a lecture. Instead, she grabbed a yellow legal pad and a fountain pen and began sketching numbers. "Imagine you put $100 in a bank account," she said, showing me how patience and discipline could grow wealth over time. The numbers danced across the page, almost like magic, but grounded in pure math. That evening, I walked home and deposited my babysitting earnings into a savings account. It was small, but it felt like independence. Over the following years, my grandmother nurtured this seed. She sent me articles, guided me through buying modest stocks, and instilled a sense that consistent effort outweighed luck. When she passed suddenly during my junior year of high school, I was devastated. Her estate, however, held a surprise. She had left me $50,000, quietly, entirely mine. My father immediately suggested I share it with Jonathan to help with college expenses. My mother agreed, but I refused. "It was meant for me," she had said. I invested it carefully, following every lesson she had taught me. Her words echoed in my head. "Wealth whispers, it doesn't shout." Those whispers became the blueprint for the life I would quietly build, one calculated choice at a time. By the time I graduated high school, the split between Jonathan's world and mine had already begun. He went off to a private university in Connecticut, tuition fully covered, dorms furnished, and allowances granted. I earned a scholarship to the state university, moving into a small, bare dorm with my meager belongings. I worked mornings at the campus cafe, studied late into the night, and tutored fellow students, clinging to perfect grades. I was exhausted, but each sacrifice felt like a brick in the foundation of my independence. Finance wasn't just a major, it was my lifeline. I wanted freedom that couldn't be taken, recognition that wasn't conditional, and a life built entirely on my choices.
College was my first true escape, but freedom didn't come easy. I moved into a tiny dorm room at Granite State University, carrying only 2 suitcases, a box of secondhand textbooks, and the quiet lessons my grandmother had left me. While Jonathan's parents had ferried him to campus with brand new dorm furniture and a brand new laptop, I unpacked my modest belongings on a scuffed desk that had seen generations of students before me. I quickly learned that independence came with relentless responsibility. My mornings began before sunrise, working the campus cafe's opening shift, steam rising from coffee machines as I memorized orders and balanced tips with precision. Classes stretched into long afternoons where I scribbled notes faster than professors could lecture, absorbing every detail in finance, economics, and accounting. Weekends weren't leisure. They were spent tutoring students, researching market trends, and balancing the first small stock portfolio I'd started with my grandmother's $50,000 gift. Exhaustion became a constant companion, but so did pride. I realized that while my parents had celebrated Jonathan's accomplishments, I could build something entirely my own, free from comparison. It was the first time I felt truly empowered, even if the world outside our family had no idea of my determination. During my sophomore year, I landed a small internship at a local investment advisory firm. It wasn't glamorous. I spent hours analyzing spreadsheets, cross-checking financial statements, and compiling reports that no one seemed to notice. But every evening, when I closed my laptop and walked back to my dorm, I felt the faint thrill of progress. Each calculation, each cautious investment, each tiny success in the stock market was a silent rebellion against years of being overlooked. By the summer of my junior year, I had grown bolder. I secured an internship in Boston with a boutique investment firm specializing in emerging technologies. Walking through the gleaming glass towers, feeling the pulse of Wall Street and the hum of ambition, I understood something I had always known but had never said aloud. I could succeed on my own terms. My diligence, my patience, and my ability to see opportunities where others saw only risk had prepared me for this moment. After graduation, I accepted a junior analyst position with a mid-sized investment firm. My salary was modest, but the exposure was priceless. I rented a small apartment shared with 3 roommates, living off instant meals and budget-conscious decisions. Yet every paycheck, every opportunity I seized, every lesson remembered from my grandmother became a brick in the foundation of the life I was building. I invested meticulously, never impulsively, and slowly, steadily, my net worth began to grow. By the time I turned 26, I had saved enough, learned enough, and gained enough confidence to take the leap. I started my own boutique investment firm. At first, it was just me, sitting in a cramped co-working space with a secondhand desk and a single chair. I focused on undervalued startups, renewable energy initiatives, and small technology companies that promised growth but were overlooked by bigger firms. The risks multiplied the rewards, and before long, my careful strategy had quietly grown my fortune to over $12 million. Through it all, I wore a mask whenever I returned home. I rented modest cars instead of flashy ones, dressed in simple clothing, and deflected questions about my job with vague explanations. At family gatherings, I smiled politely, listened to Jonathan's stories, and pretended my world was as small as they assumed it to be. It was exhausting, but necessary. I was protecting my hard-earned independence, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. And then Michael entered my life. I met him at a charity gala in downtown Boston, a casual, dimly lit evening filled with people exchanging polite smiles and fake interest in each other's careers. Michael wasn't part of finance. He was an architect, quietly respected for his ability to design elegant spaces that combined beauty and function. What drew me to him wasn't his resume, but his calm presence. He listened, truly listened, For the first time, I didn't feel the need to erase myself around someone else. We began spending weekends together, walking along the riverfront, sharing meals, and slowly letting the weight of the hidden life I carried ease. Michael never asked about the numbers I managed, the clients I served, or the millions quietly accumulating in my accounts. Instead, he asked about books I loved, recipes I inherited from my grandmother, and why I avoided family stories. I deflected, as I always did. They're busy, nothing much to tell, I'd say, my voice smooth and practiced. But one crisp October evening, after months of quiet companionship, he caught me off guard. We had just finished dinner at my apartment, and I had hurriedly ended a phone call with my mother. Michael watched me for a long moment, calm but insistent. "Why do you shrink yourself around your family?" The question landed like a stone in water. I realized the truth I had avoided for years. I had perfected the art of erasure, dimming my light so Jonathan could shine. My achievements, my life, my wealth, they all existed in secret because it was easier than confrontation. For the first time, I admitted it aloud. I told him everything. The childhood neglect, the constant favoritism, the sacrifices I had made, the wealth I had quietly amassed. Michael listened without judgment. When I finished, he said simply, "Living divided can't last forever. At some point, you'll have to choose which life you want." By the time I reached 28, my life had two distinct realities. In Boston, I managed my boutique investment firm, overseeing a growing portfolio of startups and emerging companies. Every decision was mine to make, every risk mine to bear, and every reward mine to enjoy. At home in Cedar Grove, though, I still wore the old mask. I smiled politely, nodded along, and let Jonathan occupy the spotlight while I quietly navigated the shadows. Returning home for the holidays was always bittersweet. The streets looked the same. The maple trees lining our neighborhood still reached for the sky with their autumn leaves, and the wooden swing set in the backyard creaked the same way it had when I was 10. Everything appeared untouched, frozen in a past that had never acknowledged me. Jonathan's new luxury car gleamed in the driveway, a gift from my parents as expected. He walked in with that polished confidence, waving and smiling as if he owned the entire universe. My parents, oblivious or unwilling to notice the silent tension, fussed over him, asking about classes, work, and his plans, while I was given a quick, distracted hug. Dinner that evening was no different. My mother's favorite roast graced the table, conversation orbiting Jonathan's achievements, his promotion at a local marketing firm, the impressive projects he led, the praise he received from colleagues. I pushed food around my plate, offering polite nods. My own career, my struggles, and my successes remained invisible. Later, Michael whispered as we were shown to the small guest room, its pull-out sofa sagging in the middle. Jonathan and his wife had the master suite with the queen bed and private bath. My mother explained, "Jonathan's back needs proper support," as if my own comfort didn't matter. I said nothing, though a fire rose in my chest. Michael squeezed my hand, gently, a silent anchor in the storm of old memories. That night, as I passed the kitchen for a glass of water, I overheard my parents' whispered conversation. "I just wish she had more ambition," my mother murmured. "She's always been content with less," my father replied. The words hit like ice, sharp reminders of years of silent neglect, of being overlooked, of being made small. I froze in the hallway, heart tight, and let the words sink in. Thanksgiving morning brought the familiar smell of turkey roasting and my mother humming in the kitchen. I stepped outside for a phone call, finalizing terms on a 7-figure deal for one of my clients. My voice was measured, calm, but I felt exposed standing there in the backyard where my childhood had unfolded, surrounded by the same white picket fences and familiar streets. Jonathan appeared behind me, arms crossed, brow furrowed. "Since when does data entry involve million-dollar portfolios?" he asked, his tone sharp, a mix of suspicion and barely concealed irritation. But before I could answer, my mother called him inside, setting the table. He shot me a long look, one that seemed to read through the carefully constructed layers of my life, before disappearing into the house. Later, while Michael and I dressed for dinner, he mentioned our work trip upcoming. "We'll be in Tokyo for 2 weeks," he said casually, "to meet with clients and explore potential investments." The words were innocent, but I noticed Jonathan's head snap up across the room. He stared at me, piecing together fragments of a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. Dinner continued in the usual fashion. I remained quiet, smiling politely, letting Jonathan bask in the glow of parental attention. But under the surface, tension simmered. Each glance from Jonathan, each distracted comment from my parents, each whispered judgment felt like a minefield. I could feel the weight of the years pressing down, the neglect, the favoritism, the silent erasure. As dessert was served, I decided to give a small gift, a token of thoughtfulness rather than wealth, a smart home assistant for my parents' living room. Their reaction was more telling than the gift itself. My father's eyes widened, my mother's hand trembled, and Jonathan's gaze sharpened. He picked up the package, tapping the model number into his phone, then looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. The first crack in the carefully constructed mask I wore began to appear. I realized that I could no longer remain invisible. My life, my achievements, and my choices had become too significant to hide. Michael's steady presence reminded me that I didn't have to diminish myself for anyone, even for family. That night, as I lay in the small guest room, I reflected on the years of quiet perseverance, the sacrifices I had made, and the life I had built without their recognition. I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Change was coming. The silence, the neglect, the favoritism, it couldn't continue. And I would no longer be content to watch from the shadows.
The first days back home were deceptively quiet. Jonathan went about his routine. My parents hovered around him with the same familiar glow of approval, and I moved like a ghost through the rooms I had once called mine. Every glance from them reminded me of the past, of the countless moments when my accomplishments had been overshadowed, ignored, or minimized. Yet, beneath the surface of this ordinary domestic rhythm, a storm was quietly gathering. Michael noticed it immediately. "You can't keep doing this," he said one evening as we sat in my childhood bedroom, still painted pale yellow, still holding remnants of my early years. "Pretending to be invisible, letting them dictate how you're seen, it's exhausting and it's unfair." I knew he was right. Every fiber of my being had been trained to adapt, to shrink, to erase myself. But now, after years of building my own empire, that instinct felt out of place. The quiet wealth I had accumulated, over $13 million, built meticulously, quietly, entirely on my own, was not just money. It was freedom, independence, and validation of everything I had learned from my grandmother. But it also came with the weight I hadn't anticipated, the burden of revelation. The days leading to Thanksgiving were spent walking a careful line. I laughed at Jonathan's jokes, nodded at my parents' questions, and offered the occasional polite anecdote from my work, all while maintaining the carefully constructed illusion that my life was modest, unremarkable, and invisible. Michael stayed close, silent but supportive, reminding me with subtle gestures that I didn't need to dim myself for anyone. One afternoon, as I helped my mother in the kitchen, she handed me a stack of hand-me-down recipes, suggesting I might want to update them. "Jonathan could use some practice with these," she said, barely glancing at me. I smiled politely, hiding the storm that surged within. For decades, my parents had assumed that I was content with hand-me-downs, in gifts, attention, and opportunities. But now, armed with the tools my grandmother had given me, I realized I no longer needed permission to claim my worth. Michael and I began discussing strategy. He understood that confrontation wasn't just about revealing the money. It was about reclaiming my identity, my respect, and the boundaries I had long denied myself. He said, "You need to control the narrative. If you let them discover it accidentally, it becomes about their shock and anger, not your truth. Plan it. Own it." I spent nights revisiting old memories, each one a reminder of favoritism and neglect. Jonathan's trophies lined the living room shelves. My science fair ribbons, tucked in a dusty box, remained unseen. Graduation photos showed him beaming in the spotlight while my own achievements faded into the background. I had survived on resilience, discipline, and quiet ambition, but now I needed to transform that into action. The evening before Thanksgiving, I made a choice. I would no longer allow my life to be invisible. I would step forward, unmask the years of sacrifice and quiet accumulation, and demand the respect I had long been denied. The plan was simple, yet heavy with consequence. A small gesture to reveal my independence, followed by the careful disclosure of my achievements and financial success. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, imagining every possible reaction: Jonathan's disbelief, my parents' guilt, my father's stunned silence. The tension between them and me had always been a quiet, simmering force, and now it was ready to erupt. Michael watched patiently as I spoke my thoughts out loud, offering guidance without judgment. That night, I slept lightly, the anticipation of the next day pressing against my chest like a weight I had carried for decades. I knew that once I stepped into this truth, there would be no turning back. For the first time, the years of being minimized and ignored felt like fuel, giving me the courage to finally stand tall, not just in my own life, but in front of the family who had long refused to see me.
Thanksgiving evening arrived with all its familiar smells and sounds: the roasted turkey in the oven, the hum of conversation, and the soft clinking of glasses. But this year, nothing felt familiar to me. Every detail, every smile, every casual comment from my parents or Jonathan carried the weight of anticipation. Tonight, the balance of power would shift, quietly but irrevocably. Jonathan, ever confident, strutted around the dining room, recounting anecdotes from his marketing job, his promotion, the car he had been given, the furniture he had earned, thanks to our parents. My parents laughed along, nodding, their eyes shining with pride for the golden son they had always favored. I pushed peas around my plate, swallowing the quiet resentment I had carried for decades. I could feel Michael's steady gaze on me, a calm reminder that I didn't have to shrink tonight. Finally, the moment arrived. I cleared my throat, letting the room fall into an unusual, expectant silence. "There's something I want to share," I said softly, my voice steady despite the pulse hammering in my chest. Jonathan looked up, curiosity flickering across his face. My parents, slightly puzzled, exchanged glances. Michael gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. I began with the small things, the gestures that had always been overlooked. The science fair I had won in middle school, the hours I had spent working multiple jobs to pay my tuition, the late night studying in silence while Jonathan's life unfolded in full parental view. I spoke calmly, letting each sentence linger in the air like a challenge, each word a step toward reclaiming my presence in this family. "And now," I continued, my voice firmer, "I want you to know that all these years, while I remain quiet, I built a life that no one here can ignore." I reached into my bag
and pulled out the smart TV I had purchased earlier. A subtle gesture, a symbol of my independence. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while my father froze mid-motion, fork suspended above his plate. Jonathan's brows furrowed, suspicion growing. I watched his eyes narrow as he picked up the box, quickly checking the model number and price. His disbelief turned to outrage as he read the numbers. $1,500? He barked. Since when can you afford this on your salary? The room went silent, tension crackling like electricity. For the first time, all eyes were on me. I set the TV down and met Jonathan's glare squarely. I don't work a modest office job like you think I do. I own an investment firm. We've been successful, and yes, I've been managing my finances independently. My net worth is $13 million. The words hit like a thunderclap. Jonathan's jaw dropped, his face flushing with shock and disbelief. My mother's hands trembled, clutching her napkin, while my father looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. Jonathan scrolled through my online portfolio, muttering, "Oh my God, Forbes? This isn't real. $13 million? I continued, letting each revelation build the story of my life. The scholarships I had earned, the internships, the late nights working in coffee shops, the investments I had made quietly, following my grandmother's wisdom. I spoke calmly, deliberately, painting a picture of resilience, discipline, and independence, a life forged in the shadows of favoritism, but now fully revealed. You think I've been selfish? I asked, meeting Jonathan's glare. Every dollar I have came from my choices, my discipline, and the work I put in myself. I built this alone, without help, without their pride, without anyone lifting a hand. The room was silent, except for Jonathan's uneven breathing, the sudden tremor in my mother's voice, and the slow, dawning recognition on my father's face. Michael leaned forward gently, his calm voice cutting through the tension. From what I've seen, he said, Selena has been giving to this family her entire life, not with money, but with patience, with quiet strength. Maybe it's time someone gives her the respect she deserves. Jonathan's face flushed crimson, the anger barely contained, but he had no quick retort. My parents' eyes welled with tears, finally seeing, in some small way, the child they had overlooked for so long. I stood, laying my napkin neatly beside my plate. Michael and I will be staying at a hotel tonight, I said, my voice unwavering. My mother reached out, pleading, but I stepped back. Together, Michael and I walked out of the dining room, past the untouched pie and the heavy silence, into the cold November air. For the first time, I felt the weight of decades of erasure lift slightly. The cost had been high, but I had reclaimed my voice, my accomplishments, and my boundaries. And though the fractures at home were raw, the foundation of respect and recognition had finally been laid.
The morning after Thanksgiving, the quiet of the hotel room felt almost surreal. The cold November air seeped through the window, but inside, Michael and I felt a different kind of warmth. The calm certainty that we had finally taken control of a narrative that had been twisted for decades. For years, I had carried the weight of invisibility, favoritism, and neglect. Tonight, I had unburdened myself, and while the cost had been steep, the liberation was palpable. My phone buzzed relentlessly. 17 new messages from Jonathan, swinging between outrage, guilt, and pleading. My mother left tearful voicemails, begging me to return and assuring me we could talk. I silenced the phone and let the quiet settle. It was time to breathe, to step back, and to assess the new dynamics. Michael stood beside me, his calm presence reminding me that I did not have to navigate this alone. Boundaries, he said softly, nodding toward the messages. You've reclaimed your life. The next step is to define the rules. I thought about my grandmother, Margaret Warren, whose lessons had built the foundation of my independence. She had always whispered, "Wealth whispers. It doesn't shout." That philosophy had guided me as I quietly grew my investment firm, saving and building a life that was my own. Now I realize that her guidance extended beyond finances. It was about self-respect, clarity, and boundaries. Over the next few weeks, I began laying out the new framework for my family interactions. Calls from my parents were no longer spontaneous or guilt-laden. They were scheduled, purposeful, and respectful. Conversations remained honest, but limited to topics where equality and respect could exist. Michael and I also decided to create a trust fund strictly for Jonathan's children, structured so that he could never access it directly. An act of generosity paired with protective boundaries. This was my way of giving without compromising the lessons of self-reliance. Jonathan predictably resisted. His messages ranged from incredulity to anger, accusing me of being selfish and secretive. But I had learned long ago that my self-worth could not be dictated by their opinions. I blocked his repeated attempts to intrude, focusing instead on the positive avenues where my energy could have meaningful impact. The absence of his constant demands brought a surprising sense of relief. I also began therapy, a space where I could unpack decades of favoritism, neglect, and the hidden erasure I had endured. The process was gradual, painful at times, but immensely healing. With each session, I reclaimed more of my voice, understanding that my life, my accomplishments, my choices, my success were valid and deserved recognition, regardless of family approval. Outside therapy, I channeled my energy into mentoring. Young women entering finance reminded me of my younger self, determined, underestimated, and ambitious. I funded initiatives for girls in STEM, small investments that rippled outward, creating opportunities for others while reinforcing the principles my grandmother had instilled in me. Michael was by my side throughout, never asking me to shrink or overextend, offering a partnership based on equality and mutual respect. Months passed, and the storm at home quieted into something less volatile but still fragile. My parents' calls became more measured, tinged with genuine curiosity rather than obligation. They began to see at last the woman they had overlooked, not just the sister in Jonathan's shadow, but the independent, capable, and accomplished individual I had always been. One evening, as spring settled into the city, I hung a small brass key on the wall of our apartment. I had it engraved with a single word: boundaries. The sunlight caught the brass, casting a warm glow, a quiet emblem of everything I had reclaimed. It was not just a symbol of protection, but a celebration of self-respect, autonomy, and the life I had built on my own terms. Michael and I toasted quietly that evening, reflecting on how far we had come. Together, we had turned a history of neglect into a foundation for respect, love, and purpose. For the first time, holidays felt like celebrations of choice, not obligation. For the first time, the weight of my past felt lighter, replaced with clarity, courage, and the freedom to live life on my own terms. The path ahead remained uncertain, but one truth was clear. I would never again allow myself to be diminished. I had reclaimed my life, my accomplishments, and my wealth, not to prove anything to anyone, but to honor the lessons of resilience, discipline, and quiet determination that had guided me all along. And in that reclamation, I had found peace, purpose, and a new beginning.